Hello and welcome back to Beyond the To-Do List, a podcast about productivity. I'm your host, Eric Fisher, and I'm excited to welcome to the show Melody Wilding. I teased that she was coming on the show a few weeks ago with a different episode. She is the author of Managing Up: How to Get What You Need from People in Charge. And in this conversation, we're talking about that skill of managing up, how you can communicate more effectively with your boss, make sure that your needs are being met. And Melody is sharing actionable strategies for setting boundaries, getting feedback, and aligning with your manager's goals so you can advance in your career while building a stronger and more productive relationship with leadership. And if you've ever struggled with feeling out of sync with your manager or wish you had more support in your career, then this conversation with Melody Wilding is for you. Well, it is my privilege to welcome to the show Melody Wilding. Melody, welcome to Beyond the To-Do List.
Thanks so much for having me.
You've got a great new book out. I was talking with your friend and former guest. She'll be back, so future guest too, Elizabeth Latardo, and she was talking about how your new book here, Managing Up: How to Get What You Need from People in Charge, it was something she was, then currently reading or had just read, but she was also reading a parenting book about parenting toddlers, and I thought I can see a little bit of the crossover there. And that's not to say that management is, some people have referred to it as herding cats management. Maybe it's better that it's like herding or parenting toddlers, but your book's actually about the other direction, which is not something we talk about a lot because I think for some people, they think this is a dangerous topic. Don't tell me how to manage up. Don't tell me how to, but I love the way you frame it in the subtitle, how to get what you need. So in other words, it's more about the communication. It's more about letting your boss or others that are above you in a flowchart know how they can best help you or how they can be a better leader without saying, hey, you need to be a better leader.
Yeah, it's so funny that you mentioned Elizabeth talking about the parenting book, because I've heard that so many times. People, as I've been talking more and doing more podcasts about the book, so many people have mentioned analogies between parenting and managing up. And not to say that leaders are toddlers, but I think the underlying truth of that is that human behavior is human behavior. Whether you are 3, 33, 63, it doesn't matter. Some of these principles about being able to communicate, persuade, to encourage people to make certain decisions and get what you need from them, as you said, are just truisms, regardless of somebody's age. And so, yes, that's what I'm hoping to do with this book, is bring more of that psychological element into the workplace, because no one ever teaches us that. We're just sort of dropped in and expected to know how to do these things or to suffer through trial and error. And as you said, managing up is something we do for ourselves. It's not something we do to make our manager happy. Yes, it's a great side effect that they may look good or we help them reach their own goals, but managing up is really about making sure that you have clarity about expectations so you know what success looks like so that you can advance in the organization, you can do work that's fulfilling to you, that your day is not so stressful in terms of communicating with the people above and around you, that you can set clear boundaries, you can give constructive feedback when you have that to make your life easier. So all of those things are managing up. It's not just knowing your boss's coffee order and, when they say jump, you ask how high, but that's the way we've traditionally thought about it.
Yeah. Okay. I do have another, as you were saying that, it hit me that because it's really it's not all about, but it's like 90% about communication. And if you think about it, that is when when we talk about toddlers and the terrible twos and then, it's the terrible threes. Well, actually when we talk about that, it's because they have wants and especially needs that they don't know how to communicate. It comes out in ways that it shouldn't. We all know that even now, at whatever age we're at as an adult, we've had that happen too. It just takes different forms. So we hopefully aren't doing tantrums like a toddler, but it does come out in ways that I regret that and I need to ask for forgiveness for my behavior.
Yeah, it's so true. I'm so glad you mentioned that because, yeah, managers and leaders, they are people too. They have bad days. Some of them may not have great emotional regulation skills, to your point. They are under pressures from the people above them, their cross-functional stakeholders, other people on their team. They may just not be someone who's good at articulating their vision or their goals. And so we don't want to be at the mercy of that. And some people will say to me, yeah, but this shouldn't be my job. My manager should be a better leader. Yes. And you don't want to wait around for that to happen. Your career cannot wait around for that to happen. So it's a both and that, yes, while managers need more training, people who are in leadership have an imperative to get better and be more self-aware. We can't just put everything on hold for that to happen because you will suffer as a result of that. So in some ways, we have to rediscover that agency. And as you were saying, get more proactive about shaping that relationship and the dynamics to work for us instead of against us.
Yeah, I think what I hear you saying is no matter your circumstances, you still have an amount of agency that you may not be aware of for yourself. And you also owe it to yourself to use that. So,
100%.
Yeah.
And also you will encounter difficult people wherever you go, whether it's this role. And you never know, your manager, the person who's your manager or leader today could change tomorrow. They could leave, a reorg could happen, and all of a sudden you're working for somebody new. Or you may be put on a new project and the lead of that project is someone you feel is a micromanager, for example. This is a skill set, regardless if you need it today, you may need it tomorrow. So it's important to learn it now.
Well, speaking of that, you have a layoff story. I'd love for you to share that because it kind of opens the book up contextually.
That's right. Yeah. So the book is framed around these 10 conversations for managing up, and we could get more into that. But the first one is about alignment. And yes, I tell this story of what to me at the time was this shocking layoff that seemed to come out of the blue. I should have known something was wrong when my manager wanted to meet at 8 a.m. on a Monday. That should have been my first flag. But yeah, when I dialed into the line, there was someone whose voice I didn't recognize who told me, thank you for your service, but you are terminated as of today. And my role was eliminated. And it truly, to me, came out of the blue at that time. But when I reflected back, I started to see how so much of that was the result of not managing up well. Yes, on a micro level, was aligned with my boss about, okay, what needs to get done this week, next week? Where is this project at? Where is that project at? But on a larger level, not aligned on what we were trying to achieve with the specific work I was doing, which was a pet project of hers. And because of that, I was out of alignment with the entire organization. This was something that was seen as this sort of tertiary project that my manager had some runway to run with, but that nobody else was really sold on. And that ultimately came back to bite me. So did the fact that I was not doing things like having the networking conversation. I had no other allies or advocates in the company that when this happened, no one was willing to reassign me to their team because they didn't know the value I had to offer. I'd failed to have the visibility conversation. And so all of these things start to weave together. And I hope my story is an extreme example of what can happen when you don't manage up well. But we see this on smaller scales every day for people.
You mentioned these different conversations. Specifically, you bring up the alignment conversation. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and how we go about, one, bringing that up and really how we make it an ongoing dialogue? Yeah.
And you were saying earlier that so much of managing up is communication. And you're exactly right. That was a key insight I had while writing the book, is that this skill set really boils down to these 10 different high-level conversations we need to have. I wanted to structure it that way because often when we're told you have to get better at managing up or influencing without authority, building relationships with leadership, we're really not given much more than that And so I wanted to really create a systematic playbook for someone who wants to learn this skill set, because it's so much more than just be proactive or, understand your boss's needs. It's so much deeper than that. And the 10 conversations in the book are sequenced in a specific order. We start with alignment because it's most foundational. And in many respects, it tends to be the easier conversation, sort of a softer entry point, because so much of it is about just astute observation of what's happening around you, but also asking good questions. And that's where I would suggest people start when it comes to alignment. We may think we're on the same page with our boss, but are we really? Because your boss has pressures, priorities, has goals, pain points that they may not volunteer to you, but they may not be holding them back because maliciously, but maybe they just haven't come up, or again, they don't know how to articulate that. And so the alignment conversation, people have asked me, is it too late to do this? I've been in my role for however many years. It kind of feels awkward to talk about this now. Like, do I know I'm doing the right job? But it's never too late. I always say, can you look for some natural point in the year? So you may say, oh, we're at the beginning of a new month, or we're wrapping up this quarter. We have this new project on the horizon. And so if you could find any reasonable entry point, you can say, I want to make sure we're on the same page about what success looks like here. And so to do that, there's a couple questions I would love to understand from you. And in that chapter, I give a number of different questions you can ask. One of my favorites is, what are the metrics you discuss with your own manager? That can be so insightful because it really gives you a shortcut to understanding, what does my boss care about? Because that's what they're going to be assessed against. And that may not be something that comes up in natural conversation.
Yeah. In the way that the subtitle is talking about how you get what you need from them, you're saying in this alignment conversation, have a level of awareness that when you enter in, I love the figuring out a timing thing, because there are these natural quarterly business cycle. Everybody talks about quarterly stuff in business, right? There's these natural entry points. But to go back to what I was saying, that you're trying to have a level of awareness. We may not know all of what our boss needs, but we're approaching it from, how can I give them what they need so that it's reciprocal? It's a two-way street.
That's correct. Yes, exactly. You will be successful if you look for triple wins. If you look for something that simultaneously is important or valuable to you, important and valuable to your manager, and the organization as a whole. That's something that is completely where you want to place your time and focus. But this is also an important conversation to have to sort out, is this where I want to be, right? Is this the team that is going to help me reach my goals, or where I can grow the skills that I really care about right now? And actually, to start that entire chapter, I have people do a 1-year career vision exercise, because that's what we don't want to over-index on, just what does our boss want? And then we'll just contort ourselves around that. We have to think about, where do I want to be 1 year from now? What does it look like in terms of how I'm spending my time, the type of impact I'm making, the work I'm contributing to, the relationships I have? And does that fit with the image my manager has, the needs the team has? Because it also allows you to say, oh, it's so great to hear we're investing in AI or analytics. That's something I would love to take on. Could I sit in on some of those meetings? Right. So it starts to wedge open these other opportunities for you.
Yeah. I don't know about you, but in my college, and I didn't have this happen that often, but there was one time where somebody came up to me and said, hey, so did you have the DTR? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And they're like, the define the relationship conversation. And I'm like, really? That's a thing? And that's what it came down to. But that's what it kind of sounds like you're saying, is like, without officially stating it, you're kind of having a subtle define the relationship with your manager, but also the organization.
Yes, I love that, TTR. I'm going to use that now. And this is so crucial now, as so many of us are working in distributed environments or completely remote, where a lot of that understanding that may come up organically just doesn't happen anymore. So we have to be so much more explicit about sitting down and trying to actually pull out of our leaders. Another one of my favorite questions from that chapter is, what does good performance look like in this role? And let your manager answer. And then say, okay, thanks, very helpful. Now, what does great performance look like? And that's super important because that lets you know these are some of maybe the hidden unwritten rules of how I'm being assessed. Because usually when you ask for that difference, good, they'll tell you, yeah, you're meeting these standards, these projects, these stakeholders are happy, whatever. But once you talk about great, that's where you get to some of those softer, more abstract behavioral and personality aspects that could lead you to be more successful on the team. So that's another great one to ask about.
It occurs to me that those are actually if you were in an interview with somebody, those are two great questions to have in your back pocket as the person being interviewed, because you can ask them that first one, and then you can kind of air quote wow them with they're already thinking about how to be great at this, not just good. And of course it puts it on them to kind of tell you, hey, there's your baseline, and then there's the above and beyond, which, yeah. So one of the other things that I realize is as you progress through the book, you've got all these different conversations. The next one, I think, is also a very important one. They all are, but this next one is where I think I've seen personally a lot of friction happen as well with the styles conversation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Totally agree. Yes. And that's why it's the second one, right? If we know what we're trying to work towards, like what does success look like, then the styles conversation is how do we accomplish that, especially if we have different approaches or personalities or preferences. And it's bound to happen, right? And like you said, by and far, this is the biggest source of friction that I see, because what we often perceive as difficult behaviors are often just a difference in styles. Classic example is you may be someone who, speaking from personal experience here, you may be someone who leads with a lot of context or storytelling. You care a lot about the people involved in the work and their feelings and who's on board and consensus seeking. But you're dealing with a manager who moves very quickly, who just wants the bullets, who cares more about the outcomes and the results rather than the people doing it. And that can create a lot of friction, because if you launch into an explanation and you say, well, I can give you the background first of how we got here, and then your manager jumps in and says, I don't really care about that, just give me the bottom line, you feel dismissed. And you feel like, why is this jerk cutting me off? But to your manager, what they're thinking is, just get to the point. I just want the key takeaway here because I want to move quickly and I need to make this decision fast. And so it's really a difference in perspective and values. And when you can realize that, and we can get into this more in a second, I'm not saying you have to change yourself, but when you can even realize that, oh, this person is coming from a different frame of reference in terms of what they value here, it starts to allow you to not personalize so much, to not say, this is about me, my manager is against me or doesn't like me, or they're toxic or difficult, although disclaimer, there are truly toxic managers out there, but most of it just comes down to these misunderstandings that we're talking past each other.
Yeah, in the book you talk about it essentially being like a difference between speaking different languages, and once you understand what language they're speaking, you can translate, and hopefully they'll pick up on yours as well.
Yes, that's right. Yes. And so in the book, I talk about how when we think about communication styles, there's two primary dimensions, and you can be high and low in each. And the first one is dominance. How much control or how much does someone like to assert themselves in their interactions? And then the other one is sociability. How much do they care about connections and relationships? You have high, low on each of those. You plot that, you get, broadly speaking, 4 different styles. And so even if you can start to think about that framework and plot your boss on where they may be. For example, I talk about someone who is a cheerleader personality type. That's someone who is highly dominant, but also highly sociable. So these tend to be your more like gregarious, big picture, vision sort of leader. They love storytelling. They tend to be more enthusiastic, higher energy, but they can also be very preoccupied with image and reputation. And so all of these 4 types have assets and they have drawbacks. But you can pin your manager there and also start to say, well, which type am I? And what strategic adjustments may I have to make? Because you may be someone that in the book I call a controller, someone who is low on both dominance and sociability. And controllers tend to be more process oriented. They tend to be lower key in terms of their lower energy in terms of their personality. They ask a lot of questions. They care more about the system than the people involved. And so if you are a controller type working with a cheerleader, if you just make small changes, for example, in your wording, when you are presenting something to your manager, instead of saying, this is the methodology we followed, or we want to make sure we're being compliant with this. Like that may be controller type language, but cheerleader type language may be more around possibility and potential. And we want to make sure that we're satisfying our stakeholders' requirements because they care more about the people involved and them being happy. And so just those small changes can go a long way. You're still sharing the same message, getting what you need across, but you're making sure the person on the other end hears it.
Yeah. I'm reminded that in this section, you were also talking about something called a working with me manual. And it occurs to me, some people might find that a little presumptuous. Like, okay, boss, here's the instruction book on me. And they were like, well, wait a second. Why do I have to have this? Why don't you have one? Why don't I give you one for me instead?
Yes. Yeah. One of my favorite exercises in the book is this me manual. And really this is a exercise for you getting clear on your own communication preferences. What do you need and want in terms of how do you process? You know, are you someone who likes to brainstorm and talk out loud? Do you want questions ahead of meetings? Do you have certain boundaries around your work hours? When you make decisions, how do you go about that? How do you like to receive feedback? All of those little nuances are things we often don't think about, but shape how we approach every single interaction we have. Now, your me manual, it can be something you share with your boss, but you have to read the room. You have to have a level of organizational awareness. I have some clients that work in more progressive sort of startup cultures where it would be totally normal to present something like that to their manager because the culture embraces that. But I have folks that may work in a law firm, for example, where never in a million years, it's just a more hierarchical, more conservative type of environment where that's not something you do. And so this can be something you just keep for yourself to have that internal clarity. But what I would suggest is that don't just leave it in your desk somewhere. You need to be using this data in some way. So even if you have a conversation with your boss to say, you know, as we're working on this project, we're going to have situations where we don't agree or we don't see eye to eye. How do you want to handle that? Right? And get their input on that. And then you can say, wonderful, that's so helpful. For me, here's what would be useful. And that's where you can kind of pull threads out of your me manual and start to weave it in a more organic way without that presumptuous, like, here's how to manage me better. Although I will say, I interviewed dozens of leaders and managers and professionals for the book, and multiple leaders did say, I really appreciate when someone comes to me and tells me how to get the best performance out of them, because you're making my job easier. Like, please tell me how to manage you. Give me that shortcut. Save me time. So a lot of leaders actually do appreciate that more than you know.
Come to think of it, I've been in an organization where they literally ask you that as part of an annual performance review is, wow, how can we manage you better? I think it's actually phrased better than that. It's phrased more relationally. I think it's something along the lines of, how do you prefer to be managed? Something along the lines of that, where it's your preferences. It's it's you giving them the secret sauce, in other words. Okay, so now I'm curious, what are some of the most common style clashes that you've seen between managers and employees, or even employees and employees?
Yeah. The biggest one I see is the one I mentioned a moment ago between the person that I would call the caretaker, which is someone who is low on dominance, high on sociability. So this is someone who really values stability, harmony. They need to think before they act. They're very warm, people oriented, versus someone who is a commander, highly dominant, low on sociability. So opposites there. And that's the fast, quick paced, just get to the point, make decisions. That's the one I see the biggest friction with, because the caretaker perceives the commander as just cold and dismissive, non-caring, which sometimes they can be if taken to an extreme. But the commander sees the caretaker as a pushover, conflict avoidant, which again, sometimes they can be. And so if you are, most commonly I see a caretaker managing up to a commander. And if that is you, this is where you have to make strategic adaptations, not changing who you are. In the book, I call it flexing, don't fawn. Don't try to act like someone you're not. But if you are someone, like for example, your emails should include bullet points. Instead of just paragraphs of data, you want quick bullet points that they can scan. And when you meet one-on-one, start with your bottom line. Start with, here's the decision I need from you by the end of today. After that, I can back up and I can give you the details about how we got here. But making sure that you're giving them that upfront so they know you have a point of view, you are clear about what you need from them, it's far more likely that that situation will go more smoothly.
So aside from being in alignment and having our styles merge, I think one of the other pieces then that causes a lot of friction is not necessarily knowing who's the owner or who has ownership, which is why I loved that came next in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because once you understand what you're aligned on, what the vision is, you know now more about how to persuade or influence that person. Now you're in a better position to step outside of your job description or influence decisions, make a case for something you want to do. So yes, that's what the ownership conversation is all about. You know, how do you pitch an idea, a proposal, and get buy-in for that? And so many of us, I think, we're afraid of overstepping. We're afraid of upsetting people. And so ownership, there's a theme that runs through the book, which is don't let people be negatively surprised. And what I mean by that is you don't want to come out of the blue with some decision. I think a lot of us kind of squirrel away. We work on something and then we're like, I'm going to make a big splash with this proposal. But that can raise people's defenses because we haven't brought them along. And so we need to plant seeds so that whether it is a stretch project we want to do, or it's something around our advancement, that doesn't feel like this jarring jump. It just feels like a natural progression of what we've been talking about all along. With ownership, there's this concept that I talk about. It's called persuasion, which is the precursor to persuasion. And this idea comes from Dr. Robert Cialdini, world's foremost influence researcher. Mm-hmm. And the idea is, how can you prime people to be ready to receive something so that it just feels more natural and organic. And this could be simple things. It can be like, let's say you're wanting to pitch a new process or a new workflow that you'd like the team to take on. You can gently in your one-on-ones be asking your manager about, how is this working for us? Do you see any gaps here? Or when was the last time we revisited this? So you're sort of feeling out the situation. And by doing that, you're raising their awareness of it. You're also getting valuable information about potential objections they may have, like, we can't do that because it's too expensive, or we tried that before and it didn't work. That when you eventually propose it, you can show, hey, I've considered these things. Or you may get information about who else needs to be on board. Because in today's environment, many times your boss cannot make a decision unilaterally. They need buy-in from their manager or maybe a committee or other project leads, for example. So that's really important, because managing up, whether it's with ownership or its visibility, its advancement, managing up has to extend beyond your boss. And that's a mistake most of us make, is we just stop with our main supervisor and we're not thinking about that broader ecosystem.
Or they do like you did when you made the mistake of skipping that immediate supervisor and sending it out in an email to everybody.
Exactly. Exactly. Right. Like you think you're being bold and you're putting yourself out there, but yeah, it tends to backfire.
Yeah. I can't help but think of this idea that it's not about the pitch itself or the idea itself so much as it is the how that it's pitched, or not just the how, but all the other reporter questions, the who it gets pitched to, the why, also the how, but then the when, right?
Yes. Yes. And that is so crucial because most people don't consider this. We can talk about visibility separately, but we often think it's solely about what we have accomplished. Like talking about the end result or the outcome is important, but if you want to be seen as more leadership material, or you want to be more regarded as a thought partner, something I talk a lot about in the book is moving from this subordinate mindset, the order taker mindset, to more of the trusted partner and advisor. And a key way you do that is in the book, I refer to it as operational transparency. You give people visibility into how you arrived at that conclusion, right? What other aspects did you weigh? Did you talk to certain people? And so you're showing your ability to think strategically, to solve problems, to weigh different concerns. And that sometimes signals so much more and creates such a stronger perception than just the idea itself.
Yeah. Obviously, there's also the component of if you're presenting an idea, you'd love to have credit for it, but you talk about this claiming credit versus building credibility. Talk a little bit about what the difference between those two is.
Yes. Yeah. It's such a good point, right? We're in this atmosphere now where we have to straddle this line of wanting to be a team player and also wanting to get individual credit for our work. And so a concept I talk about in the book, one of the tools actually in the visibility chapter, I call it we, then me. And this is a great way to balance those two things, where you start with the we. Here was the collective effort, right? Here was what the team did. You may shout out specific people, your executive sponsor, your colleague, whoever it is. And then you follow that up with, here was my individual effort. Like, I really enjoyed taking on this piece and had a lot of fun working directly with product on this. And so you're balancing those two things. You're giving credit where credit is due, but you're also building your own credibility with people.
Yeah. I love that. It's one of those things. Again, I see the overarching approach here is it's less about, even though we're talking about business and there are business transactions happening, it's not transactional, it's relational. That's the overall key here to keep in mind. The overarching perspective is this is not about managing or manipulating something. It's about fostering proper relationships, which again, you said earlier, not all managers, not all organizations are good for you. There are toxic situations. How do we, let's go there, I guess. How do we, if we've tried a bunch of, and there's so much more in the book, but if we've tried having all of these different conversations, is there one of these conversations that is the kind of indicator to more than the others that, oh, maybe this isn't where I should be anymore?
Oh, that's a good question. And when I was writing it, I was almost thinking of them all as kind of go or do not go.
I guess they all have they all have a signal in some way to them, I guess, if I think about it a little harder. But I'm just kind of curious if there's one that you've seen your clients when they've had, okay, I'm going to have this conversation, and that's the one that kind of becomes the exit door sign lit up for them.
Yes, I would say I'm going to cheat. There's
probably
two.
More than
they kind of go hand in hand. Yeah.
Okay.
And I would say it's boundaries and feedback, because that's where we're getting out of, okay, if you're not aligned, that may be something you can work around, especially if you're not, a lot of people are not aligned on a micro level. And what I mean by that is you may not always agree with how your boss approaches something, a certain strategy or relationship. All right, you may have different styles. Okay, that's also something you may be able to deal with. Ownership, sometimes it's understandable that the organization may say, hey, this idea that you want to do, it's just not something you can do right now. But when we start getting to boundaries, which is how do you push back diplomatically and say no, or feedback, how do you give constructive input up the chain of command? That's where if you start to get chronic pushback or you start to become gaslighted in those situations, if your manager or the leadership is not receptive to any of your input and says, well, we don't care if you don't want to do this work, you need to figure it out, even if that requires you working 7 days a week, that's where it becomes extremely unsustainable. So I think both of those are two that start to more seriously become, this is not a sustainable situation for you.
Yeah. What are some of the ways that, again, it's about knowing timing, right? You don't just have one bad conversation and you just throw up your hands and I'm out. Because most of us, we either stay too short of a time or too long of a time. And again, that's true in relationships too. It's about having the right judgment overall. So, how would you say, I know it's all contextual. I know this is the silver bullet answer for all of the things. I totally get that. And I guess that's what I'm trying to look for. And I think that's probably what everybody's trying to look for, but it's not that easy, I guess. So let's just say, what are some of the ways that you can say, here are my 3 strikes or something along those lines when it comes to them?
Yeah. And I wish my job would be a lot easier if it was that clear cut. Like you said, the 3 strikes rule is not a bad one. That is something I talk about in the book because we don't want to react to just one situation. Our own emotions or our own exhaustion may get in the way. And what might feel like a giant problem today may not feel like that tomorrow. So the 3 strikes rule, I always say you want to look for a pattern. Has this happened 3 times? Or if it's difficult behavior, like maybe your manager is putting people down, is that something that you've seen them do with 3 different people across 3 different contexts? That's when it starts to become, this is more of a pattern. Other people see this. This is not just me. And this is happening over time. And if you have tried everything I share in the book and in the book all along the way, because I know, again, managers are unpredictable. They are people. So all along the way, I'm giving, if this happens, if your manager responds this way when you try to give them feedback, here's what to try. If they try to refuse to be refused, here's another thing you can do. Here's what to do when insert situation happens. But if you're trying everything, your mental health is taking a hit. You deep down in your gut know this place is not, and this manager that I'm working for is not aligned with my values, how I want to work, then it's probably time to move on. But I will say, I've had plenty of situations where people don't have to leave the organization as a whole. If you do what we're talking about in the book, especially things around networking and visibility, you may have other advocates who are willing to take you over to their team. I've had this happen to numerous clients where if you're in a pretty sizable organization, if you have someone who's willing to be your sponsor and pull you over to their area, then you don't have to up and leave totally.
Yeah, I've had that happen, actually. Both good and bad examples of that, where I've felt like I'm stuck. I have tried all I can. Wish I had this book then, because I would have had more to try and more intelligently tried, but then ended up leaving the organization entirely. But I've also done it the other way, where I've moved to a completely different department because I've had slow but intentional conversations that were subtle and then been able to make lateral moves. So you just never know. In other words, feel out all your options, not just for where you are, but across the board where you are internally in an organization.
Exactly. And even if you do decide to leave, you have to realize that that is still a point where you need to manage up, because you never know what's going to happen, where you may encounter your manager again. Maybe they are a vendor you have to work with or a regulator or in your next role.
Yeah.
Your colleagues, your manager's manager. So even when you have the quitting conversation, that is still a managing up moment.
Yeah. It's a decision and it's not to be taken lightly. And, how you leave is what you're going to be remembered for. But I think, again, kind of going in and having that, you're trying, exhausting all the options in terms of all these conversations, which I think so far, I think we've only touched on maybe 4 of them. We're kind of in the quitting conversation at this point, which is the last one. But I think that, yeah, it's having that kind of, I don't want to call it a checklist, but, having that, here's how far I'll go, here's what I'll tolerate, but beyond that, I won't anymore kind of list. Or I'm going to try all of these. And then if I can't make any headway, or even if I make some headway, it's a time frame, it's a checklist, it's all of the above, it's all of these things. But again, you have the agency and the ability to advocate for yourself, and you have to do that if you feel like it's just not going to change, but you have to try it. Otherwise, you might be on the other end of it later and have exit remorse, because you might find yourself in a worse situation. I also have had that experience too.
Exactly. And that gets back to what I was saying earlier, that you need to learn these skills no matter what. Like, yes. I think managing up gets a bad rap as something you only do when you have a difficult boss. That is not true. Of course it is pivotal. Like, it's a non-negotiable to do this when you do have a manager you don't get along with. But even if you have a great boss, these are muscles you have to build, because you never know what's going to happen. Work is only getting more complex. I know we didn't touch on advancement too much, but that's another situation where your boss is just one of many decision makers who literally can decide your promotion, because it may go up to a panel or a committee. The organization may only have a few promotion spots available per year. So you have to understand all these different politics and dynamics that are going on around you, even if you individually have a good relationship with your boss.
Yeah. Yeah. You definitely have to, again, like most relationships, you can't just have it be an emotional thing, because that wanes from positive to negative on a daily or even an hourly basis for some people. And but because it is about a relationship with you and your coworkers and your boss or your subordinates, it is all about relationships and communication. You do have to have an analytical side, a structure to it. In other words, there has to be because it's business, you also have to not just have the relationship side of it. Like most good relationships, there is an emotional component to it, but there's also something about agreed upon decisions and commitments made, etc. And you have to honor those. So it has to do with this is what we're talking about, is that side of things. Most people, they go in and they just fly by the seat of their pants with the emotional side only and decide, I don't like it here anymore. My boss is a jerk. I'm out. And then they don't realize, and again, you jump ship. You can, like myself, find yourself in a different organization that at first seems so awesome, and then you realize, oh no, this is worse. How do I go? I can't go back.
Yeah, it's so true. And the more you rise in the ranks, the more important these relational skills become, because that's what you're assessed on at that level, which again, it's a rude awakening for a lot of people, because you spend your whole career getting good at your craft. And then there's this switch that happens where, yes, you still have to produce high quality work, but you got to manage the people around you. And I don't mean your direct reports, but you have to manage the personalities around you, and your ability to do that, to communicate clearly, to set expectations, to create diplomatic boundaries, that becomes the measure of your success.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, this is really a lot more about you managing yourself. So, and we don't like to admit that, but in a way, your book could almost be called Managing Yourself Up. But that doesn't work as well. So trust me, you made the right choice.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because my first book is called Trust Yourself. And it's all about managing yourself, because you were just saying before, most people get to this place where they reactively are saying, I'm being mistreated here, I'm out. The reason why I wrote Managing Up is because after my first book came out, what I heard from people again and again was, okay, I have these tools to manage my own doubts, insecurities, but where I get stuck is I can't stop second guessing where I stand with other people. I don't know where I stand in this organization or how people see me, or am I going to have a job here in a year? And that doubt can cause you to act in some weird ways. And so what I was finding is that let's not internalize this as some failing of you just being weak or a people pleaser or just a chronic overthinker. There are actually just very practical ways you could explicitly have these conversations to get the clarity you need. And if you don't get that clarity, to make just a more grounded decision about like, okay, I tried, this is not the place for me. I'm going to move to somewhere else. And earlier on, you were saying, actually, these are good questions to ask in an interview. 100%, because you can start to ask, even, of course, like what does success look like here, but even non-obvious ones of things related to the boundaries conversation. So in an interview, you could bring up, I am sure there are times when the team is juggling multiple projects. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with having some of those bandwidth discussions and start to get out of them? What does that look like here?
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of conversations that need to happen, some of which are with our own self. Others are maybe with the book as we go through it. I think we did touch on 4 of the questions the conversations out of the 10. So much more in the book. I want to point people to where they can find out more about you, the book, and everything else you've got going on. So where can we do that?
Managingup.com is the best place to find more details about the book. Also there, make sure you enter your name and your order number, and we will give you access. I have an entire bonus vault of the different worksheets and scripts from the book. So a lot of people are loving that. So Managing Up is the best place.
Perfect. And I'll make sure to link that up in the show notes. And Melody, great talking with you. Can't wait to do it again sometime. Let me know when you've got a new book.
Thank you so much. It was a lot of fun.
Well, that's another podcast crossed off your listening to-do list. I hope that you enjoyed listening in on this conversation with Melody Wilding, and I hope that you are walking away with some insight into managing up so that you're able to set better boundaries, give and get better feedback, and figure out how to align better with your manager's goals so that your career moves along at a stronger, more productive pace. If you found something helpful in this episode, and I hope you did, would you do me the favor of sharing this episode with somebody you know needs to hear it? Hit that share button in your podcast player app of choice, or head on over to the show notes at beyondthetodolist.com. That's also where you'll find affiliate links as well as links to sponsors so that you can help support this show. Thank you so much for sharing. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you next episode.